Gargi? You can hear us? Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Our program today is Democracy and Dictatorship, Polarization and Plurality in Today's World. I'm Debbie Ford. I'm an associate professor in the EDD in Leadership. And our Zoom guide is Tim Piper, one of our candidates in the EDD in Leadership program here at Creighton. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. We have people obviously both in person and on Zoom. So Tim will be monitoring the chat. There will be time at the end of the program for conversation. So first of all, we'll overview the program. I'll introduce our panelists and then we'll start the questions. Across the world, democracy as both a set of values and as a system of government is under threat. Authoritarian regimes such as China, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia seem to act with impunity both within their borders and on the world stage. Despite horrific conditions for their people, regimes in Venezuela and Belarus seem remarkably resilient. Furthermore, the rise of hybrid regimes that combine performative elements of democracy within authoritarian systems seem to be on the rise. Recent events, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as populist assaults on democratic institutions in Chile, Peru, Brazil, and the US, have led some to questions as to whether democracy can survive. Our panelists will discuss these and other important questions during this session, and audience members may pose questions either in person or via chat later in the session. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Erica Moreno, Dr. Jim Martin, Dr. Moises Gutierrez, and Dr. Gargi Bias, who is on Zoom. Dr. Moreno is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations. She's trained as a comparative political scientist with a specialization in Latin American politics. Although her primary focus is democracy and its institutions, she has also worked on topics that have addressed stability of regimes, democracy and autocracy, political transitions, and the role of regime characteristics on economic outcomes. Moreno's work on Latin American politics has appeared in a variety of venues, including book manuscripts, peer-reviewed research articles, reviews, and book chapters. Currently, she is working on research that explores how democratic institutions contribute to trust in democracy in Latin America and beyond. Dr. Martin is an associate professor in the EDD program in interdisciplinary leadership. He received his PhD in comparative politics at Florida State University. His research examines democratic government cabinets, particularly in Eastern and Western Europe. Lately, his research is focused on the facets of identity expressed by individual cabinet members and the collective influence of diversity, or the lack thereof, on the tangible political outcomes of governments. Dr. Gutierrez has had a diverse career, to say the least. After serving as a vice director for tax collection for the Mexican state of Guanajuato, I'm sorry. He entered the Franciscan Order at 29, ultimately serving immigrant and ethnic minority communities in over 50 countries. He has an MA in Intercultural Relations from Lesley University and a PhD in Global Leadership from Gonzaga. Most recently, he has joined the faculty of the EDD program in Interdisciplinary Leadership as an assistant professor, and we're very happy to have him. Dr. Bias is an assistant professor in the EDD program in Interdisciplinary Leadership. You can see a theme here, I'm sure. She received her PhD in political science at the University of Kentucky, and her research considers how economic sanctions, especially those issued by multiple countries, can be more successful. She also works in the field of women's rights development and is currently co-authoring a project on how women's economic rights can protect women from sexual violence during armed conflict. So, to get started, let's start with our central concepts. What is democracy?
All right, we'll get started. So democracy is defined many different ways, and I think you could say that political scientists would probably agree that there are at least 10 to 15 different ways in which we can define it. So to keep it as simple as possible, we can talk about very thin versions of democracy, right? Where there are basic institutions, but maybe not the same protection for civil rights and liberties. We can then kind of go along that scale all the way to the thicker or fuller democracies, which will have the basic institutions, the basic practices, but also protection for civil rights and liberties, speaking. So, and they allow for competition. That's an essential part. Allow for competition and allow citizens to participate in some form in the selection of that government. So just in general terms.
Yeah, it is interesting to note when you look at the various measures that political scientists have devised over the years to help us capture what democracy is. There's about, I don't know, 20 different ones. There's probably more than that.
Yeah.
And everybody has their favorites. One thing I would add is that the Adam Przorsky quote, of democracy is a system where parties lose elections and transfer power peacefully. So I would chime in with that.
Just one sentence, the nature of reinforcing structures, like really in the ideal way, in the ideal perspective, how different structures support each other and reinforce each other for the good of everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely agree with all the points. Democracy just feels like such a wide concept that you have even dictatorships like North Korea call themselves the Democratic People's Republic. So I think it's now even more important to really clarify what democracy means, like what are some democratic norms. And I definitely agree with the criteria all of you mentioned, such as free and fair elections, peaceful and widely accepted transition of power, institutions and structures that are respected. But I wanted to add something similar to that to the definition. I think democracies also include ethical and stable institutions that act as checks and balances. So you can have a democratically elected leader, but it's also important to have a good code of law that can hold the leader accountable. Some legislative body that also does something similar. So I think democracy, there's a lot of focus on democratically elected leader, but the other institutions around the executive are also important to keep in mind.
Okay. What is authoritarianism? Let's take a step.
Gargi, you want to double up and do authoritarianism too?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So I think we probably all would agree that authoritarianism is usually characterized by violation of some political and civil liberties. And it's not, while this is an example of an authoritarian regime, it might not always look like a government with high levels of repression and human rights violations like North Korea and Afghanistan right now. It could also be a very benevolent dictatorship like Singapore. But I think what really captures authoritarianism is when countries compromise things like electoral integrity, things like electoral fraud, can look like imprisoning opposition like they do in Russia. It can even look like showing distrust in the political system. This is how we can predict the move towards authoritarianism. It can also show up in ways such as increased human rights violations. It can be something like discrimination to violation of freedom of speech, more violent physical integrity violations like extrajudicial imprisonment, torture, etc. But I like to think of authoritarianism as almost a spectrum. You can be more or less authoritarian depending on how many of the factors I just mentioned you compromise on. So that's how I would define it. What about you all?
I would say like in the extreme form, this blind submission to authority, but can be one leader, one person of a small elite, general.
Yeah, I would play off what both of you have said in that we sometimes you can consider these sort of archetypal forms, Hitler's Germany being one. And yet when we see them in practice, it's not always as clear cut as that. And there are variations, you can have monarchies, you can have, military dictatorships, you can have authoritarian regimes which are led by civilians, you can have a dictatorship that's a cult of personality around one person. There's a lot of different ways, but to the larger point, those folks aren't giving up power willingly in most cases. And you have, selectorate theory. Like you have a very small group of people who ultimately is responsible for whether or not that person continues or that group continues to serve. A very tiny percentage of the population ultimately has influence over who or what group is in charge.
Yeah, I like everything that everyone has pointed out, and you're absolutely right. I was going to say selectorate theory. It's a good way to think about this, because when we think about democracies, we tend to imagine like one or two ideal cases, right? And when we think about authoritarian regimes, it's kind of it's a myriad of options. But one of the things that really separates these types of regimes from each other is how many people get to participate in decision making. And selectorate theory really kind of focuses on that, right? If you've got a very small number of people who are going to be making those decisions and they cut everyone else out, that shrinks. And as it shrinks, you get more highly authoritarian. As it gets larger and includes more actors, whether they're institutions, courts, legislators, politicians at state, regional, local levels, or mechanisms that include citizens directly, direct democracy, for instance. We saw the progressive movement in the US, which started in the upper Midwest and allowed individual citizens to place a check on elected officials, either through reform, referendum, a variety of different ways. So that selectorate gets larger the more you include different institutions, and that also includes social institutions, which is something we haven't really talked too much about, but Gargi was kind of touching on that earlier. So thank you for that point. So yeah, it's kind of that shrinking and enlarging of that electorate or selectorate. That's kind of the key differentiation.
All right, thank you. How would you define hybrid regimes?
Yeah, so that's a fun one. So depending on which measure you're using to look at regime type, you can kind of focus on the extremes. And I like the point made earlier about these regimes being on a spectrum. So more or less authoritarian, more or less democratic, right? And so if we imagine at either end of the spectrum, like highly authoritarian on one side, highly democratic, inclusive on the other, if we kind of move towards that middle, that anocracy area where it's kind of this gray space, you may have some features that are democratic, like maybe elections, but maybe those elections are not decisive. Maybe you've got some other sort of elements that look democratic, but in practice, you don't really have a sort of democratic ethos. There isn't really a shared decision-making structure. It really is intended to look like it's democratic, but it's not. And in part, that's a function of pressure that there was, very strong pressure across the world for countries to adopt democratic forms of government. And no one wants to be the pariah. Now, these days, there are more people, more countries willing to stand out and say, yeah, we really don't believe in this anymore. So it's that adoption of those sort of the facade of democratic governance without the actual elements of it. Those are the hybrid regimes.
Could I jump in real quick? A really interesting case of a hybrid regime that I would say possesses some element of legitimacy would be Iran, in that you have an unelected side of the government, which is clerical based and that sort of thing. And then you have an elected side. Now, the folks that can run for elections are chosen by the unelected side, but the elected side also has a body which has some influence over the selection of the Supreme, there's a council.
Supreme Council.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Supreme, hey, I remember things, it's good. Yeah, and so, and functionally, you know, if on paper, that looks great. You know, it seems like, hey, that's an actual marriage of those two things where the rules are kind of on the table, everybody knows what they are. But at the same time, it's not democracy, you know, because you have almost all of the military and economic power being reserved by this unelected side. And so in some ways it is for show, but in some substantive ways it isn't. I mean, they've had some elections of presidents who were not popular with the clerical side of the governance.
Do either of you want to add?
Yeah, when Jim was talking about examples, I thought of the example of Guinea real quick. This is just exemplification of what everyone has already been talking about. I wanted to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
I think Guinea is a great example of a country that was actually trying to be more democratic, but I'm thinking it was 2021. Making sure my ears. Yes, in 2021, they tried to have an election. The election did not go super well. The incumbent president at that time wanted to run for a third term. And in just that time where they wanted to ensure that democratic principles were being followed, the military took over. Like you have hybrid regimes like that, where there is intention to have free and fair elections and a properly elected leader, but just that time of political confusion allowed a coup to happen. So I do think hybrid regimes can also, in addition to countries that have political facade, it can also be countries that are trying to do their best, but it's just too much political instability.
Okay. To some extent, you've started to answer this. So if you want to add to what you've already said, how do we know if a country is a democracy?
Okay, so I guess I'll keep going back to there's so many different ways to measure this.
Okay.
So we can disagree a bit on this, and actually political scientists tend to disagree on this. You know, if you've got a measure, like let's take one of the more common measures that goes from, you know, -10 being most authoritarian all the way to +10 being most democratic. If you have experts, you know, chime in on all the various elements of that governing structure and its society, you could still have disagreement over where a country may lie along that spectrum. And then some disagreement over, you know, where exactly is the line where you can say, okay, you've passed this threshold, you are democratic. Not only are you democratic now, but you've got all of the fundamentals to remain democratic for a long period of time. So the concept of consolidation of democracy is one that's also really, we have not resolved that. So there are disagreements about that. With that said, I think that as a discipline, we've gotten better about not just identifying what may matter more in certain circumstances and reading beyond just, you know, just the governing structures. And I think we've gotten better at it in part because the sense that many countries were backsliding and the sense that that backsliding was also hitting us domestically meant that you've got a lot of folks who were really keen on measuring not just one element of democracy. And I don't mean just one element, because all of these measures have like 10 or 12 dimensions to them. So there's a lot there. But I mean, in terms of many of the measures that are out there focus on expert opinion. You know, folks who have studied these countries for their entire academic careers, who know a lot about what's happening inside of them. So that's one element, right? But the other element is, how do people in those societies view the way their country is governing, and whether or not it's actually allowing for participation, which is another really important question. And it's one that's also incredibly relevant in the US. So political scientists have sought to kind of bring those together in a variety of ways because of the concern that, We need to be better at identifying, where the moment is, where the last gasp of democracy takes place, and when it takes place in real time, as opposed to 10 years after the fact going, okay, that was the moment when things went south. So I guess I'm not really answering your question.
Conversation.
But I'm getting closer.
Okay, so you know what next question is. How do you know if it's an authoritarian regime? The opposite of our.
Gargi has thoughts.
Thoughts, okay.
I was just doing deep breathing. No, but Erica, I definitely understand, like, when you were like, I don't know if I'm answering the question, because I feel like I'm in that space. It's so difficult, like, especially all the data sets we use to categorize countries as democracy and dictatorships, they vary so much. And a lot of them believe in that spectrum idea, like no country is like 100% a democracy. Like, for example, according to Freedom House, the US actually fell into the partly free category, which accordingly means they're not a democracy, they're an anocracy now. I think like only 20% of countries in the world are now considered full democracies. So it's really hard, I think, to determine if a country is 100% authoritarian or 100% democratic. I do think it's easier to predict shifts towards and away from authoritarianism. And I think it gets back to all the points everyone said before, like things like quality of elections and how much people can participate and accessibility of participation. And does the leader step down peacefully and does not argue that the election results were fraud? All these things can definitely help predict where on the spectrum you lie. That's why I think it's hard to clearly identify authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I just want to add that a lot of this is consent by the governed, which is part of the reason why, as a discipline, we're trying to get better at measuring this, because ultimately it is citizens saying, you know what, I will give up, having absolute freedom. I can walk around naked and shoot my guns and, take from whoever is nearby. I give up some of that because I willingly want to participate in this broader organization, city, county, municipal government, country, et cetera, where there are some limits placed on the things that I can do. I can't do absolutely everything. But I do that in exchange for some sort of process that's out there that I may not know the outcome of this process. I don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now, but I know that there is a process that I willingly participate. So this exchange has to take place. So it's consent of the governed, which is really hard to get at. We are getting better at it. And I agree that we're better at identifying, like, okay, there's a move that took place in the last 3 or 4 years. And that sense you gather from a variety of different sources, and you can sort of pinpoint, okay, well, this is a very odd conversation we're having this polity about, having maximum liberty, because, that sounds wonderful, but in reality, you have to give something up, right? So whether or not people are willing to engage in that process is another part. So that's also kind of to the point about whether or not leaders decide at some point, okay, I lost, I step down, there's a process, I get it, I'll back away and let someone else in charge. The minute you start seeing elites driving that dissonance, you get a little bit of a lag, but you tend to see citizens do the same thing. And that creates this really weird, toxic mess that leads to those shifts. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, just to jump in briefly, one example, we're seeing something like this play out right now in this week in Turkey, in that President Erdogan is up for re-election. Neither he nor his party is currently predicted to win, although polling is not very great in Turkey. But he's behind by a substantial amount. And then he also has some kind of illness, which is taking him off the campaign trail. And there's a lot of negativity surrounding his world for a lot of reasons. If he had been reelected, the way that the arc of that has been, he probably wouldn't have had to face that challenge again if he were to be reelected this time. Now, what does that mean? I can't predict the future, but those kinds of things happen. And often too, I see like out and beyond our worlds of academia, we see people say, this characterizing, when we were in Chicago and the person had been to Sweden and said, well, the fascists have taken over Sweden. And it was like, well, their party got into government, but they don't have a majority. I mean, these things happen. Or somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, where is that democracy? Is that an authoritarian regime? Is it leaning one way or another? Like, those are hard things to really say with any declaration. But hyperbole doesn't help,
Right. It seems like at one point after the fall of the Soviet Union, democracy was on the upswing. What happened?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Who wants to stab at that one?
Gargi, you have thoughts?
I'll let someone else start this one.
I'll jump in. A lot of things, many things. I mean, you see at post-Soviet times where you begin to see under Yeltsin sort of this quasi-democratic kind of like, we want to get there, and they're trying to build these institutions and things. You see that kind of thing, and sort of this, I don't know, very much US centric attitude of, okay, well, we won, we're, everybody, you remember the end of history and the last man, this kind of neo-conservative viewpoint of like, well, you have these institutions and you build capitalism and everyone will become democratic, and we'll be laughing at these would-be authoritarians in 20 or 30 years. Well, that didn't quite pan out, and you see things like, I mean, frankly, like the EU gathering together has created a tremendous amount of dissent within the EU itself, based on legitimate concerns of people over, sovereignty and economic rights and all kinds of things. But in a broader sense, I would say, when you see this backsliding, to really sum it up, it's the easier, softer way for those elites to just slowly grab a hold of those reins of power. Jon Stewart recently said that authoritarian leaders have it easy. I don't really think they have it easy, but from that perspective of, if you want to control the kind of levers of society and you want to control the resources and the money, authoritarianism is the way to go. So anyway, I'll stop now.
There was a really good argument made by two economists, and they kind of focused on how societies, as they develop economically, right? As they develop economically, there are certain incentives created for, usually elites, because they're often the ones making certain rules, that there are tendencies, right, to maybe expand participation, expand access, and continue to grow in that direction, right? So growth and economic growth is then sort of mirrored in other areas, political and social growth as well, especially in the sense of expanding and including greater numbers of people. And one of the things, there's a really interesting thing that takes place, right? So the world sometimes gets knocked over a little bit. There are external shocks that take place, and those are important to keep in mind too. Those external shocks can come and they can kind of disrupt what's going on inside these societies, disrupt it in some way that also then drives elites to act somewhat differently, maybe closing off access or closing off avenues for people to participate either in the economic structure, in part because, you know, greed does exist, but also in part to just sort of limit, you know, the multiplicity of voices that they may have been, you know, seen flourish in other times. And I think about that a lot because I think that at the time that the Soviet Union opened up, that was kind of like this big shock, right? And you have elites in the Soviet Union also signaling like, okay, well, this system didn't work. We were sitting kind of a binary system. This system doesn't work. Let's try something else. So they're signaling to those in their own society, let's give this democracy thing a shot. But there are a series of economic shocks that follow that, right? The expansion of the world happens very quickly. It may scare existing elites in a variety of different places and may encourage the closing off of those sorts of opportunities. I think, you know, what is now Russia is a good example of it, right? The Russian economy opens up, but what does that mean? Who's in charge now? Well, it just so happens that if you happen to be a very wily mayor of a Russian city, and you now have all of this food aid coming towards you, you can distribute that food aid, or you can send it off to your buddies and make a nice little profit. And then while you're doing that, you know, there's really no sense in opening up government and making it transparent because you have now engaged in this transaction and you want to continue doing that. So there are a variety of things that take place, right? So that initial opening, I think, was kind of a shock, and how to handle that is also important. But we have subsequent shocks that take place since the early 1990s, the 2008 crisis. COVID is clearly another big international shock, and each of these things, they reverberate across the world in different ways. Elites are going to behave differently, and they may close off access in some places and open up. It's just kind of depending on how that economic shock affects that local population. So I think I tend to focus on some of that economic story because I think that's important here too. And folks were promised, hey, you adopt democracy, as Jim said, you adopt democracy, you become capitalist and wealthy, and it's all good. And it just goes in this straight linear path and everything's fine. And we just go off into the sunset, end of story and scene. It's never that way. It's always more complicated than that. And I think our neighbors to the south could have told us that a long time ago. They experienced that in the 1950s and 60s, where their economies were booming, you know, everything's going great. And then all of a sudden, wait, this is a little chaotic. We need to maybe settle this down a little bit. And then you see incentives of those elites to just sort of close off access. So I think we're just kind of seeing that across the world.
We're just reading something a little bit about the world being on disarray, you know, and actually really leading people to exploring different different governments or whatever. So that was actually also, you know, reflecting a little bit on the whole idea of complexity and uncertainty. And people like certainty. People tend to like certainty. People like to, you know, so and also simple processes and stuff like that. When they don't experience that, I mean, they really feel this disarray and loss and everything, trying to look for other responses or other possibilities. And I guess that's an ongoing thing, something that might be different perspective.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Moises just said, and combining it with what Erica was talking about. When you think about countries that, like in the third wave of democratization, countries that became independent in the 70s and 80s, they were in high levels of political instability, like the type Moises was suggesting. But then you had Western countries basically impose these regimes or suggest that they should follow these government structures that this country's not used to, was not prepared for. So you had these pretty weak governments in very politically unstable environments that were not set up for success. We see this stuff show up in human rights work as well, like this disagreement between the Western norms that are imposed and the cultures and history and experiences of the countries where they're imposed. In addition to that, I think a big reason why the spread of democracy isn't as evident as we might have expected after the Cold War is we maybe weren't focusing a lot on what the autocracies in that time were doing. Like since that time, especially using economic means, you have countries like China, like setting up the Asian Development Bank as like basically an opponent to the World Bank. Like you have countries like Venezuela that are authoritarian getting support, being able to overcome the effect of economic sanctions. You have Russia being able to not face the cost of sanctions because they're getting help from China. So I feel like in addition to democracies struggling to continue democratizing and becoming stable, I think the authoritarian regimes in the world were also stabilizing themselves and creating this network where they could uphold each other. So I think that can also explain why we see very strong authoritarian regimes today.
Yeah, one last thing that I wanted to say is that, you know, we've been talking about economics a lot. And another aspect of that is to kind of flip it around and say, you know, economic inequality is a tremendous influence on these things. And so there's a number of models, game theoretic stuff, pretty advanced things that, you know, you reach some kind of threshold of economic inequality and you could have revolutions from the right or the left. Whatever that means in an ideological sense these days, but you know, inequality is a worrying factor in many situations.
It is, and I think that's why so many of these regimes and so many of these, you know, little autocrats, I guess we can call them, have railed against things like globalization. Globalization is this boogeyman. It means lots of different things to lots of different people, but I think it's proxy for, oh, the world opened up and now we're worse off. And that really speaks to the issue of inequality. In fact, inequality is such a serious trigger for all kinds of bad things, like just so many of them. That the American Political Science Association has put this as its key issue to study, and it has for the last, 5 years or so, where they have created working groups and a variety of different ways in which to look at inequality across the world, because it is the one thing that will corrode government structures. It will corrode societies, and it destroys the kind of basic trust that is necessary for democracies to function. So, yeah.
I'm going to skip the next question and go then expand on what you're talking about. What has been the influence of globalization on the dynamics of democracy and dictatorship? I think you've just opened that question up. Are other comments you want to make about that?
Gargi loves globalization, right?
I think globalization is amazing for the spread of norms. There's a reason why a lot of authoritarian regimes start off by blocking the internet. It's like access to information and books and talking to people in other countries. That's like the biggest threat. At the same time, you do see countries that are authoritarian that use it for their benefit. So for example, China is a big part of our globalized world today. And the amount of influence they've ended up having because of this economic strength. You can see, for example, the Czech Republic released a statement that they were neutral on the Uyghur genocide going on in northern China right now. You have countries that identify as democracies being neutral in response to obvious human rights violations. So I do think while globalization is really good for the spread of ideas and democratic norms. One can say the Arab Spring was a direct result of, it was like a social media revolution. I do think that it can also be used by authoritarian regimes.
It's interesting how, I was screen a little bit about to prepare for this, how both sides will say that we benefit by globalization, like authoritarians will say, yeah, this group is going to benefit by globalization, and the same with democracy, will benefit because of globalization and stuff like that. And I was actually really thinking how, how globalization can actually the whole idea of the challenge of interconnectedness, I can remember a friend of mine when I told him that I was doing my dissertation on the development of a global mindset, he got so upset. I mean, so upset because it's the whole idea of the whole notion of globalization is like you really create this global community with same values, with same approaches that can be maybe authoritarian. They will see that as authoritarianism. I said, this is it, and everybody should follow this. So a misunderstanding of globalization is not happening in any of all of us. This fear of globalization or some kind of selfish interest on globalization and everything that we can use it in that way, and that can really create this kind of a fear in people and governments and situations because we don't know how to respond to that because of the conflict, the interconnected. A nephew of mine just called me the other day, yesterday, because he was having these challenges and difficulties, in his life, and he just didn't know how to respond. It was so complex and so difficult because it was all over the place, and just tell me what to do. I mean, wait, tell me what to do. How I respond to that, really, leaning towards authoritarianism because it's so complex. Because of globalization, there's so many factors that can come into place, and he just didn't know that. So even though he's what I call in a democratic system or whatever, I mean he's still under difficult circumstances like globalization, interconnectedness, the tendency to say, "Tell me what to do. I'm lost." And that's what I was thinking. Some of the countries like or people in the people, they say, we don't know what's happening. We don't know how to respond to that, how to react to that. And say, yes, please, tell me what to do. And what some of in that regard, some of the religions in different countries are turning towards authoritarianism, which is tell us what to do. We don't know how to work. We don't know how to proceed. I mean, that's something also. That's why globalization has a big thing, and the whole interconnectedness thing, and the whole complexity and uncertainty and all of it. And people know how to respond to that.
And I would add this, when you, again, I'm not an economist. We were talking a lot about economics, and globalization is in some sense an economically founded thing, but the folks, the governments and the economies and the firms that established what the international system for open markets would be, as you said, those elites prioritize their interests first. And so when globalization began to occur, in a really widespread way, really in kind of the 70s when people are going off gold standards and things like that, and allowing capital to flow in different places and all those things, there are, to your point about shocks, there are many examples of countries that were not part of that system in a fully integrated way that essentially were left out of that. For instance, cotton farmers in Uzbekistan and people who agricultural concerns in West African countries that cannot compete, that could compete on the world stage, but are squeezed out by the functional institutions that govern how that stuff works. On the other hand, there are many examples of South Korea is an amazing example of If you look at South Korea and North Korea in 1960, their relative GDP per capita are the same, you know, and to see the explosive growth in both, you know, real income for the citizens, but also democracy in a country like South Korea is really stunning. So it's uneven and it's not fair. And even within countries, there can be different effects of globalization. I taught some students many years ago who had been working in various industrial concerns in Iowa, who those businesses, when NAFTA occurred, picked up and moved their operations to Mexico and some other countries. And the government stepped in and funded their college educations. You know, amazing socialism. You know, but they did it because they knew that that would impact them. So they got this package of stuff and they were able to go and essentially retrain themselves. On the same side, you see, you know, swaths of American society that were largely kind of damaged and destroyed by globalization, and places like Ohio and Michigan and stuff like that. Detroit being a clear example of some place that had 1.5 million people and now has 300,000 or 400,000, you know, so.
Yeah, that story played differently, because I remember when I was in grad school having a professor tell me, you know, we're going to look back on the days of the Cold War longingly. And that was his prediction, because what happens when you break the system apart, that is a simple binary, very few who existed outside of that, then you have a lot of like, okay, what's next? What do we do? What are the alternatives here? And it creates a lot of confusion, to your point, yes, and that creates a lot of uncertainty, and for a lot of folks, that's an issue. And I think globalization is another good example of this, because when globalization comes to the US, right? If you recall, I was around. So I remember the way that it was presented. One party would say, well, globalization is great for the bottom line, and it spreads our our influence across the world, and it's time that we do this. And the other party sounded very, very similar to that. So there was one line of thought with that. And for the folks who were in, you know, like I have family members who were working in manufacturing at the time. Some got out, but many did not. Many were told this factory is shuttering and find something else to do. And the story was globalization would make everyone's life better off. You will have access to all kinds of stuff. Don't worry about it. You'll be retrained. There'll be a new sector for you to survive into. But that there was a gap that was created for many folks. And much of the literature on globalization suggests that this kind of feeds into current perceptions, but there is some truth to it, that the folks at the lower ends of the economic spectrum in the developing world do better, because it does bring new industry, new concern, new opportunities that they didn't have. It also changes society there. But for those on the lower ends of that spectrum, in places where those manufacturing concerns already existed, they do worse. And we know that to be the case too. And when there is no, like, here's the next stage, here's the next, you know, the next career or profession, when there isn't a real clear line, for the few who got college educations, it's awesome. But for many, that was not the story. And so you create this bitterness and antagonism, and a sense that someone overseas took something from me. That resonates in a lot of the language that we see that autocrats have picked up, a lot of xenophobic anger that taps into that. Again, it's sort of like this misplaced, you know, anger. We don't know where it goes, but it goes somewhere over there, and it's someone who took my job. And then, and then they also have to show up here in my hometown. So that's the problem. It's easier to do that. It gives you certainty. It gives you a bad guy. And that's part of what we're seeing with globalization, even though it's much more complicated than that. I think we'd all agree that globalization had some really wonderful things, right? But that's, you know, if you're hurt by it, that's not what matters.
I'm gonna change the topic a little bit here. Many conflicts these days involve dictatorships. Are these regimes more conflictual? And if so, why?
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. All the studies say, yes, they are. They are most likely to pick fights with other countries, whether they're authoritarian or democratic. So yes, they are much more conflictual. There's a lot of reasons for that. And I will allow my colleagues to shed some more light on that because that's really my area, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think the basic idea that scholars argue is dictatorships have less people to make happy. So this is like a very simplified version of the argument, but democracies cannot just enter a conflict to achieve their ends because in the next election cycle, they will be voted out for like extreme behavior. So it's just the audience cost argument that the audience in democracies will actually hold you accountable, while in dictatorships, you have more flexibility. However, a fun finding, which fun, please don't actually take the word for what it is even though dictatorships are more likely to start wars, democracies are more likely to win. And a big reason for that is people argue that if democracies will get involved in war, it's going to be wars they can win. Because losing a war is definitely, you're probably not going to get reelected if you take your country to war and lose. So democracies are way more likely to win wars. There's also this other theory. My answer is very theoretical, so I will let my colleagues give more examples. But there's this democratic peace theory that democracies don't fight other democracies. They have a lot of other ways to come to an agreement, like diplomatic negotiations, trade agreements, just more. They are also less likely to have disagreements because they tend to share norms. But we do see that dictatorships are more likely to fight. Democracies will fight dictatorships and are more likely to win, is at least what the data shows.
And I would say that, you know, in authoritarian regimes, you also have echo chambers that are within those regimes themselves. And these are very opaque things. We don't necessarily know because you know, it's not like a democratic country where you know who all the people are and who they have, you know, shadowy maybe. Back in Soviet days, I remember you would look at photos and try to read the tea leaves about what it meant that this person wore this kind of jacket and this person wore this one, or this person says that they like jazz, you know, and all these kinds of things. But in essence, these are very closed off and they don't share information. And additionally, their sources of information from outside of that little closed world are limited, and the ability of even people who would know things to tell truth to power is often fatal to do that. I mean, we look at like Saddam Hussein's regime. If you tell the boss bad news, you might not be around for very long, and even if it's true, you know, and so those kinds of things can lead to miscalculations, which historically we see that a lot with authoritarian regimes, just making the wrong bets on whether they can actually win these wars, or, you know, oh, the special military operation will last a week. Well, didn't quite pan out that way. You know, Chinese conflicts with Russia that became armed, China's conflict with Vietnam in the late 70s, and other things like that, you know, evolved out of accidents. You know, India and China have had numerous clashes over their borders that could be just based kind of on machismo of little units that are stationed on some, you know, mountain somewhere. And so, you know, these things kind of have a contagion and spill over, and oftentimes at those kind of levels, it's more interpersonal and they're closed off information loops. They don't know things. And so they make bad decisions.
I was also, you know, thinking when you were talking, like one of the things that especially the vocabulary we use when we talk about this, we often again see that we talk about the winning and losers again, winning and losing, and then both sides demonize each other. And I was actually really thinking, I mean, for me, on my own sake, for my own, how can we, or how can I move beyond that to be able to have first of all, a dialogue and understanding, an understanding of the complexity of the whole situation. Yeah, so moving from this, fragmented approach to understanding each other, and fragmented approach to understanding the different systems, the different governments or whatever, to be able to develop a different approach to that will be more integrative, I can say, instead. We're using a different rhetoric instead, because then the separation will become. I went online and I typed, authoritarian and democratic, and it was black and white, red and white, and all of those opposite, rhetoric and perspective, which will lead us to continue winning and losing, and continue and demonizing each other. And what I'm saying is, how can we really? And one of the things about transdisciplinary perspective is in perspective to all of this. How can we, beyond that, beyond our perspectives and approaches, to be able to have a different understanding of all of this.
We don't have a great segue to the next topic, so just bear with me. How can democracies strengthen their own institutions against extremist politics?
There's that.
Yeah.
So I don't have a good segue to it.
So that's a tough one, because ultimately democracy is many things. There are, I guess the thing that distinguishes democracies from other regimes really is the fact that there are practices, there are rules in place. It's the outcomes that are unknown, but the rules of the game are set up in advance. So like any board game that you may play with family members or friends, you agree in advance. We're going to play this game. We're going to roll the dice. However this turns out, it turns out. And that's kind of the key marker of a democracy, right? So the rules, the institutions that support those practices, that's one part of the story. And there was a sense for a very long time among democracy scholars that, there's nothing really new under the sun, right? Democracies are kind of old and, they take this certain form. Representative democracies tend to have like these different, divisions of authority. And in some really interesting cases, you may have overlapping circles of jurisdiction and federal systems and things like that. But we've seen a lot of changes, right? A lot of countries adopting different pieces from here and there, adopting different rules and norms to better get at what is going on in their society, right? So the ability for those institutions and those rules to really translate what is taking place in the society, what matters to citizens, and bringing it on up the food chain so that new rules, new laws, and new practices can be put into place is really important. So that's like step one. Then there's a whole other element, which is, the consent of the governed, right? So do citizens really want to participate in this? That's another area that's really, really tricky. And that's the one area that we've seen movement in, and not movement in a good direction. So these things connect, obviously, but when you start seeing polling results in different democratic societies where people say, yeah, I can't have a conversation with my neighbor because if we talk about politics, that's just like, I don't know where that's going to go. I'm afraid to have that conversation. That is a problem. Where you have folks saying, it doesn't really matter who gets elected. They're all the same. They're just a bunch of fill in the blank bad adjectives. So maybe we shouldn't have that, right? Maybe it'd be easier or better for us if we had fewer people in charge and they clearly identified, we're going to do this, this, and this. Particularly when there are survey questions that ask people, would you be okay with the military running government? They're professional, they carry out rules, they have orders, right? This is what they do, that seems less chaotic. When you have lots of citizens in democracy saying, sure, that's fine, that's problematic. And we have seen that movement in public opinion. We've seen it. For those of us who study Latin America, we've always seen that, right? The desire for dicta blanda, which is like a soft kind of dictatorship, has always been there. There's always some part of the society in Latin America that'll be like totally okay with that, right? But when we see those sorts of responses in advanced industrialized democracies, including in Europe and the United States, that is particularly troubling. That's a tougher one, right? Because you can change the rules, assuming you get members of the elite to change the rules and the procedures and practices to stay open and to allow for, people to participate. That's also challenging, but it's getting the public on board, right? Buy-in. This is really worthwhile. That's trickier. I wish I had an answer for that. I don't have an answer. Some of it's going to have to deal with the institutions, but some of it is coming from other places.
I have thoughts and feelings. So, I would say that, speaking to the leadership students that we have in our Zoom audience, that this is a constructivist thing. This is a individual level effort. I fully agree when you see assaults on voting rights and other institutional features that protect those rules. That's troubling, and voting is an answer for that in many cases. But in my world, I regularly encounter people who have views that I find troubling. And so, it's my job when I have the mental health to do so, to kind of say, it's not quite that simple. I had a conversation with a guy, and it was a polite conversation, but he was convinced that he's like, you're a political scientist, right? I'm like, oh yeah, sure I am. And he said, isn't there really, now tell me this, and this is a guy who owns a business and has a decent income, served in the military, he's got a pool, his backyard, he's got kids, all these things. And he said, isn't there really like a secret group of people? There's like a world group of people that run everything, and the step from that to, virulent anti-Semitic kinds of things, just immediately, that's where that idea comes from. And I'm like, no, I have never seen any evidence of that in everything that I've ever studied. And I can also assure you that I'm not part of the secret world group, but I had an opportunity to speak to another guy he essentially viewed many of the kind of leanings towards authoritarianism as his God's will, and this was fated, and people were chosen for particular roles regardless of what they actually did in life. And we had a conversation, and I don't think I convinced him of anything. But I took that time, and then I went and I was kind of scared for a while, making people aware of issues, especially at the local level of this is what's going on. And, these are the complexities of this issue as I understand them, not presenting myself as hey, I'm super smart, Dr. Martin, but rather I kind of see these things, I've read about it, and I see this thing, and you should write so-and-so, you should do something about that. Those kinds of things I think matter.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very necessary point. I think Erica and Voices in the previous questions, you mentioned this too. The idea of political knowledge, like it's hard to have trust in democratic institutions when you don't have, you might feel like your opinion doesn't really matter. And with the inequality discussion we had, people don't have time to go seek out political knowledge. It's hard to just work full-time, just make ends meet in a highly unequal society. You don't have time to go read and gain political knowledge. And I think ignorance is not a good word, but the lack of political knowledge is what allows things like demonizing workers in the other countries. That's why globalization is bad. Oh, and trans people are scary. So we are going to have anti-trans laws. And I think the connection between inequality that we see in democracies today and the consequent lack of ability to go seek out this really complex political knowledge. Like I've been studying this for a decade and there's so much stuff I still don't understand. I think that is what leads to lack of understanding and distrust of institutions. So the question about how to strengthen democracy, I think the key is, like Jim said, grassroots level awareness, decreasing inequality, letting people have the time to check things out, maybe run for office. I think those things would increase trust at the low level, which hopefully will increase trust in democracy in general.
I want to add something that you just pointed out about the lack of political knowledge, and it is difficult, right? I mean, if you're working several jobs just to make ends meet, you've got bigger issues on your plate, the last thing you're going to do is go read, whatever journal in political science to try to learn a topic, right? You don't have that kind of time. I want to add that there's an interesting little bit of research that I have been kind of working in this area. There was an interesting finding just a couple of years ago that looked at access to the internet and social media as a potential factor here, right? So like globalization, the ability to get information has been made easier with technology. And that means wonderful things because it means that I can access knowledge more easily than I could have 10 or 20 years ago. It also means it's very easy for me to access only a small slice of that knowledge, so that only the things that confirm my existing biases or perceptions are the only thing that come to me. And I can filter all that. And then you add the algorithms which are intended to ensure that I maximize the amount of time that I spend on whatever given platform is out there, then that really just feeds whatever pre-existing notions I have. So it doesn't add to knowledge, right? So it's this weird situation where we're in the information age, but we are also largely easy prey for misinformation, right? And disinformation. And that makes things even more complicated because I also don't have time to figure out which is a good source, which isn't a good source. I mean, everyone has opinions on these sorts of things, but it does make that more difficult. And this body of research seemed to indicate that as access to all this information increases, the perception of democratic governments and governance in general gets worse. Right. And some of that is just kind of a function of if you're reading arrest reports, you're going to think everyone's a criminal. So you read about terrible things that are happening in government. So your evaluation of that government is bad. But it could also be that you are funneled into specific areas of that information ecosphere that maybe don't help that at all. And that's difficult.
Talking about also the whole knowledge creation, knowledge of political knowledge, and that's why I was talking to you earlier about the importance of the approach, the mindset you have to create that political knowledge. And, we tend to be with this fragmented mindset that we separate, instead of integrate. And I was just talking with a friend also not long ago, and he was telling me the whole situation in Mexico. But he said, "Oh, this is happening in Mexico. It's happening, blah 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 blah." We talked for a couple of hours. Then after that, I said, "But that's your opinion." No. It's what it is. No. I mean, it's like nope. So again, how can we go beyond that, as a mindset to create knowledge, in particular in political knowledge, which is so complex.
I read an article some time ago, and I think it was a Brazilian study about social networks and identifying people within neighborhoods who people would be like, he knows about politics, she knows about politics, we should go talk to them, and this plays out in the same way. And I was also thinking in a similar way how we haven't really talked about, you brought up misinformation and disinformation and the weaponization of those by authoritarian regimes, which who's the guy's name? He's the Yale.
Tim Snyder.
Yeah, Tim Snyder is a historian from Yale who's basically presents this really interesting argument. He's this former Soviet Russian expert and talks about how this is nothing different than an individual level KGB exercise on how to break down a person. They take that strategy and they blow it up and they apply it to a society. They find the things that bother you or divisive and they push that button. They don't really know what it is. They know that it bothers you. And that's kind of what's happened over the last years. And it is there and it is happening. And these entities do try to manipulate elections. And frankly, we've done it too, let's be fair. But that's out there and being aware of that and being able to have press literacy and be able to see what that is and what's legitimate or not, I think is, having some reasoning about it is important.
I have one more question for the four of you. Sorry, Gargi, were you gonna say something? No, you're good? Okay.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with Jim. That's
Oh,
all.
okay. I have one final question, which is actually two questions to ask you. And then there are questions in the chat and I'll have Tim ask those on behalf of those participants. So finally, how do each of you see the future of democracy? And how might we work to share leadership mindsets or strategies that advance the inherent dignity of people? Big question.
I talked last, I don't want to say anything. Step on anybody.
All right, let's do the first one. How do each of you see the future of democracy?
Okay, I'll go first. I'm doing quite a bit of research, just looking at the public opinion side of this. And it's very depressing. So I'd like to think that there's a lot of literature that talks about cycles and cyclical developments. I suspect that we are in one of those cycles where the performance of democracies is really having people at large, citizens, maybe question the validity of these institutions. So if they're able to change, if they're able to adapt, then I see that future as being positive, right? I mean, there's out of this crisis, I don't know if we're really hitting crisis point, but for some countries, there is a crisis moment right now, right? This isn't working. It's not making things better. What can we do? In many instances, I think there is certainly lots of opportunity for growth, but growth happens, there are growing pains. And I think we're kind of in that space. So maybe in the short term, it wouldn't surprise me too much if we see more incidences of backsliding. We see more of what we have seen in the past. But I don't think that that's permanent. And I think the fact that we can see, and I think there is some discussion, in the popular realm of, there's a democratic world that seems to be having, some issues, right? Hitting those adolescent years where things don't seem to fit right. How do we grow out of this to be better? And there is certainly a camp of authoritarian states that, like several of you have pointed out, really have a lot to gain by pushing that button, right? How can we continue to feed authoritarianism for a variety of reasons of their own? China, obviously, Russia, there's certainly a partnership that's going on there. I don't think that is where everyone is going to wind up. Authoritarianism, probably won't disappear. I mean, it hasn't disappeared. Even at the height of the third wave of democracy, it didn't disappear. Certainly expect it to stick around. But I think for those countries where there are, where this is taken as an opportunity for growth, I think it could be positive.
Yeah, well, the thing is that we're talking about globalization, and I'll say we're still really trying to learn about the whole situation of globalization and really with the difficulties. I mean, that there's research say, that leadership, appropriate leadership to deal with the whole challenges of globalization is very small. I mean, we don't have formed leaders, from even the different organizations and governments and education with an appropriate mindset and skills to be able to help us if you want to, or work together through all of this. So it's going to take some time, I think, to be able to adjust to the whole reality of globalizations and the challenges to be able and to form the necessary leaders for government and for organizations to do that. So it's still a lot of work.
Go ahead, Jim. Go next.
I would say too, sometimes we can view some of these authoritarian regimes as somewhat like monolithic and impenetrable. They have many, many problems of their own. I mean, you see this, with the mass protests of women in Iran over the last 6 or 8 months. I mean, that is a regime crisis for them that we might not appreciate, how much that really shook them. And their repressive acts in response are a signal of that. When you look at it, especially a regime like Putin's Russia, so much corruption underpins everything that happens there, that it's so inefficient and so wasteful, and there's so many things about it and someone like him, again, thinking of selectorate theory, he's got to watch his back every single minute of every day. And many of those authoritarian leaders are in the same boat, and they're distinctly aware of that. I mean, they saw what happened to Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, and they fear that, but they fear their own people as much as they fear in external intervention. And so I'm also very hopeful when we see examples like Jardin and what was her name from New Zealand? My
Jardin.
favorite country. Yes.
Yes.
Where these people become, in essence, kind of like global rock stars for democracy in many ways. And that's exciting, to see that kind of enthusiasm and like, look at this, people can do things and we can have democracies that work and get things done. And but that's where I would say I'm have to just put it out there. Like, I'm a fan of democracy and I'm unapologetic about that. And so, I'm not a both sides kind of person on that issue in any way, shape, or form. And so I remain hopeful of a brighter future ahead. But to Erica's point, we're navigating some tough waters right now.
Gargi, is there anything you want to add as we wrap up this portion?
I'll be super quick. I think all three of you have already said really powerful things, but I 100% agree. Like all these examples, like people protesting in Iran and Myanmar, in Brazil and Nicaragua, like these people are putting themselves in the line of fire to like fight for their integrity, for their human rights, for their right to decide their own future. So I truly think, and this kind of gets at our students in leadership, like I think change happens at the very small levels in your own organizations, at your own level of work, like focusing on things like equality at the lower level. I do think it pans out to equality at higher levels, like such as governments. So I think the future of democracy definitely lays in the hands of people. Like it started off as something for the people, and I think the future of it lands in the hands of the people too. And addressing inequality at your own local level will eventually help us achieve equality at higher levels as well. And I can go on a whole thing about the inequality of international regimes, but that's for a different panel.
Tim, do you want to, thank you, Gargi, I'm sorry. Tim, do you want to open the chat questions or read
Yes.
those chat questions?
Yes, I'd be happy, and I'd invite anybody listening to drop a question in there. Father Fernando asks a question related to higher education. He says, one of the things that higher education is focused on today is critical citizenship education. Is that leading to establishing democracy to a greater degree?
Open to anyone?
I think that ties into our political knowledge discussion, right? And especially I feel like university level education tends to be more unbiased. So I think that would only be a good thing. That was my first thought, but Jim, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say much the same.
Sorry. It's hard to see when people are about to start, as I just did again. So sorry.
I think there's a lot of history with this among political scientists. Like when the discipline just started to form as its own discipline, that was a lot of the focus of what political scientists did, which was to create responsible citizens, to first focus on their ability to understand the system that they're in, to participate in it, to have something actually some skin in the game, so to speak, right? As a discipline, we moved away from that for quite some time, but I think we are kind of back in that space, and in part because much of the empirical literature has really kind of focused on a handful of things that are really, really important for democracies in particular. And I'm going to put my fan hat on, just like Jim, and say I'm also a fan of democracy. So many of us who have been trained as political scientists, that's the one bias we have. That we are happy to share with folks, that moving away from that, kind of focusing entirely on the empirical literature and the data analysis and everything, has led us to identify those key factors, inequality being one of them, that are really important to the survival of well-functioning equitable democracies. So that requires education, and not just at the university level, but it requires it everywhere. I mean, we do engage in a process of socialization in every country. And in democratic states, we start when kids are really young, sort of teaching them about this is how this functions, and you can participate, student council or whatever, elections. But I think it is really important that we today really focus on this. And I think one of the things that several of you pointed out, which is the value of dialogue. So engaging in deliberative dialogues with each other about these issues. And that means not shirking away from the fact that we may have differences. One of the things that hides is that underneath those initial political differences, maybe the same exact fears and concerns that could be tackled by something else, right? But until you break down that fear of the other or the inability to talk to the other, you don't get any further with anything else. So it is really important that we engage in these sorts of dialogues, and sometimes they're uncomfortable, but that's necessary. It's part of growth.
And one of the challenges has to higher education also, how important is to go beyond individualism. It's like my friend said, no, this is it. This is what I believe. This is it, And how can we? I mean, there is supposedly, really a mega trend, a global mega trend on individualism. So also, when we're trying to really explore more of a more collective perspectives or collective approaches to even to political issues. I would retrain our minds to go beyond the I.
Can I ask the next question?
Yes,
Okay, Jim Wetzel asks, when thinking about fragile or nascent democracies, what's the responsibility of established democracies to provide leadership and engagement to balance or counter-influence authoritarian regimes?
That's a tough one. Because there are circumstances where I think one of the examples that I think of is in the wake of the tsunami, where you had tremendous devastation in so many places. And the US military was able to step in, provide aid, do a lot of things like that. And that's a use of hard power for a soft power purpose. And so that people there and those governments and local governments and the regular people there in those different places were able to interact in that way. Other forms of soft power influence, I think, are far more effective than armed threats and things of this nature, which our governments in various times have done too. And so coalitions of people, and it really emphasizes the participation of democracies in bodies like the UN and other international institutions to kind of work together to, if necessary, like instance with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to have a comprehensive strategy for approaching that, and yet to all back channels and talking and always talking to people anyway. But that kind of approach, I think, is definitely the responsibility of democracies.
I agree. There's a certain soft power element that is important, right? The ability to demonstrate some of the benefits of democratic governance abroad is important. I mean, without that, other countries might decide, hey, we'll just go back to monarchy, or this nice little model that the Chinese government is showing us, and also they're giving us some money, so we can do all of that. So it is important to provide that, but there is a fine line between providing an example and providing a cookie cutter template that everyone has to adopt. It doesn't work that way. I mean, I remember back to the invasion of Iraq and some of the dialogue going on at that time about how important it is for us to spread democracy by sending the tanks abroad, and that's not how that works. I mean, we knew going in that was, well, those of us here knew that it wasn't going to work, but it doesn't work for a lot of reasons. I mean, you can't force people to do things, and you can't force them to adopt a decision-making structure that is alien to that society. There was a really interesting news study that I was listening to. It was on NPR probably last week, and they were talking about the valuable role that the Jesuits played in relaying the kinds of governance structures that they saw among the indigenous tribes in North America. They transcribed this Iroquois Confederacy ideas, and they said, wow, this is really interesting. And the Jesuits took it and they took it back to Europe. And in Europe, then it winds up becoming a critical part of this Enlightenment structure. So I think about that and how germane some of these institutions that we have in the US really are to this soil. And people come across, from many parts of the world to the US and adopt these structures because they are germane to us. It doesn't mean that they can't change. Obviously, anything can be changed over time, can be altered, and can be perfected, I guess, if that's possible. But I think about that all the time, and any effort to just sort of, provide a package deal to Venezuela or Sudan or the Ukraine is going to fail because it fails to recognize what is going on in those societies and what's important to represent.
Also the cultural issues, that there is something like what they call power distance. That's a country with high power distance and they are waiting for someone to tell them, or what to do or whatever. So, it's completely the low power distance and no, I'm in charge of my own thing. So that's why, and that's one of many dimensions of culture that needs to be considered to be able to.
Yeah, I do think in place of like an overall, this is the model you should follow, I feel like stable governments and democracies can actually do more specific things, like, for example, encourage sign a human rights treaty, like instead of an overall upheaval of your regime, maybe start with small things. It could even look like being prosecuting a dictator with the International Criminal Court, like just low-level stuff that encourage eventual like better leaders and more stability before they even attempt a democratic system. So I think based on the question that was asked, I think I definitely agree with what Erica said, like one cookie cutter model doesn't apply to anything, but I do think there are aspects of democracy that countries can share and promote, and soft power is definitely a great way to do that.
Are we good, Tim?
Yes, Dr. Ford, how much time do we have?
We're exactly at 4 o'clock.
Okay, and if I could ask a personal question, I could personally ask a question. I would be interested from each of the panelists to know one book they would recommend to extend our thinking about this.
Awesome question.
That's a good one.
And as I do it, I'll type it into the chat.
What immediately comes to mind, which is a kind of a left field choice, but that's probably not surprising to anybody who has ever spoken to me, is I immediately thought of The Art of Power about Thomas Jefferson. And what was really fascinating about that book to me was how, and it's a compilation of letters and historical documentation of his time in government and beyond. And what is kind of shocking about that is we're facing a lot of the same problems today, because in the end, you have humans are humans and they do human things. And, many of the same challenges, you could be like, there's this extensive discussion of poverty in West Virginia, for instance, like, has it changed that much if you've ever been there, go to Washington, DC, you're at the seat of empire in many ways, and then drive out to West Virginia, and in 200 and some odd years, the same struggles are going on. And so it's a fascinating and very human kind of book that illustrates the kind of inner workings, at least at that time, of that kind of emerging democracy, because I wouldn't even say they were democracy. So, but
it's a good one. So my recommendation is by the two economists that I briefly mentioned earlier, and I didn't give you the names, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail, 2012. Really good book. I've been handing it off to a number of students. In fact, my copy is gone. So I think it's a really good book, and it really details how at critical junctures, elites and states make decisions that either close off access to opportunity or open up access to opportunity. And they talk about this historically in various different periods of time. And they look at, the opening up. That includes opening up educational access, which allows for people to get new ideas and generate new economic models and just put countries on the path to prosperity instead of failure. So they focus on the economic element, but it's really driven by these political decisions. And when those economies close, it also means that there's a concerted effort to close off the political system as well. Fewer people are participating, and that gets more and more narrow, which winds up creating a system of economic and political failure simultaneously. So theirs is, I really enjoy the book. It's written by economists, but we cite it all the time in political science. And it does focus heavily on how important those institutional decisions are.
That's a great author, Erica.
And one of the books that I said is A World in Disarray. I was talking about, that's the sort of situation now, how it is with globalization, and then what we want to do with this. How do we want to respond to this world in this difficult transition or situation? And I guess Has, if I remember well, is the author.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, Dr. Gutierrez, what was,
You guys know that, right?
what was the name of that book?
Oh,
The book is A World in Disarray. A World in Disarray, and I think the author is Has, H-A-A-S-S.
Got it. Got it.
This book, this question threw me off. Like, I cannot think of a book that I would recommend. One that came to mind was the Levitsky and Ziblatt book, How Democracies Die. That's a pretty good book on democratic backsliding, but I think it's a really good book, and I would recommend that everyone check it out. But like, when someone asks you a question, like recommend a book, you want it to be this amazing book that's life-changing, and I don't have an answer like that. But if I think of something, I will reply all to the invitation and send you the title.
That's a great idea. We're gonna do that.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tim. That was a good question. All right. I want to thank everyone for participating and for the panelists for being here. Very good conversation. So, thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
I hope you get home tonight, Gargi.
Yeah.
Me too.
It's
me know
10:30
if you
p.m.
did it
arrival. Thanks, Moises. Thank you, everyone. I learned a lot. It was really nice presenting with you all. Thanks, Deb, for facilitating, and
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
thank you. Take care.
See you guys. Oh, Tim, you're gonna have to hit the stop button on the recording.